Hello once again for the conference The World in 2023. We have a special guest from London. It's Joan Hoey. Hello and welcome to Sarajevo conference. We have some special questions for you. The first one is considering Britain, the pandemic, the Brexit, and the war in Ukraine, accompanied with the high energy prices and sanctions against Russia, created a recession and a record inflation in the UK. The new government of Rishi Sunak is trying to make things better, but will it succeed? Is Mr. Sunak capable enough after the so-called thin lady, which was, pretty bad?
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Delighted to join the conference once again. So let me come back to Rishi Sunak in a minute and whether he'll be able to manage the challenges facing the UK. Just to say to start with that, given everything that's happened over the past few years, the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and before that Brexit, the Brexit vote, it's hard to disentangle all these things and the impact on the UK. So Brexit was always going to be disruptive in the short term, and having to deal with two other global crises at the same time has made everything worse and probably much more difficult. So UK government since 2016 have had a lot on their plate to deal with. And the result has been, as you mentioned, a lot of political turbulence for the UK, which is quite unusual. We've actually had, I think, 7 governments. And the main problem,
Italy, isn't it?
Well,
it's almost like Italy, isn't it? It's really strange. Italy was famous or infamous for the short-term governments, and Britain was always having long-term governments with high stability. And now it's really I haven't seen it in my 50 years of in the 50 years of my life. I didn't see that in Britain. That's really amusing in a way. Really exciting, funny, and I don't know. We'll see what's going to happen. Just sorry for interruption. Please continue.
No problem. I'm glad that you find it amusing, and many people around the world seem to find it quite amusing. And we're now reading all the time, Economist in the New York Times or other outlets abroad, seeming to take quite a lot of delight in the misfortunes assailing the UK. So there's a bit of Schadenfreude probably there as well, which I think has probably been there since the Brexit vote. Now, and obviously what's happened has damaged the UK's reputation for political stability. It has been unusually turbulent. And I would say that the reason why that is, it's not even so much the these 3 major challenges that the UK governments have faced. That every government around the world has faced the challenge of dealing with the pandemic, the fallout from the pandemic and from the war in Ukraine. Plus, UK has obviously had this Brexit issue to deal with as well. But the problem has been much more the internal divisions and disarray within the Conservative Party, which persists to this day. So can Rishi Sunak overcome them is your question. Now, how is he doing so far? He's not been in office very long, but so far he's managed to lift the Conservative Party in the opinion polls from a low of 20% to 25%. So the Conservative Party is still trailing way behind the Labour Party in the opinion polls, and Rishi Sunak is still facing divisions in his party, lots of squabbling going on, lots of divisions which don't seem to be going away. Now, Mr. Sunak is competent. He appears to be in control of the issues, especially on the economic front. That's his forte, if you like. But he, like his predecessors, he does not seem to have a very clear vision for the country that could unite his warring party. And this fundamentally is the challenge that has confronted the Conservative Party, and to also to a lesser degree, because they've been in opposition, the Labour Party as well. So I would say that even if he manages to stabilise the government and manage these divisions in his party, the Conservative Party is likely to lose the next election in 2024. Yeah, we should remember that the Conservatives have been in power since 2010. They've been there a long time, a dozen years, more than a decade. So perhaps a spell in opposition will allow the party to focus on what it stands for, and put an end to the divisions that have been so disastrous for the party and for the country over the past few years. Just coming back to what you talked about at the beginning, the coming recession, the outlook for the UK and Europe and the world in 2023, we are heading for a very difficult year. If you think the past few years have been quite difficult, unfortunately, we're confronted by another one. And that's because despite China emerging from its zero COVID policy and opening up, which will, provide some boost to growth in China and therefore in Asia and the rest of the world, we're still confronted with the fallout from the war in Ukraine, which is driving these very high commodities prices, supply chain disruptions, and particularly through the weaponization of energy by Russia, problems in terms of energy price and energy supply, which is particularly affecting Europe.
Yes, thank you. The second question is also about the world, should I say, not about Bosnia and Herzegovina. Is going to be like question 3 and 4. But I think that we will ever be back to normalcy like we had in 2020, and when? Do we need some kind of the new deal and the new Berlin Congress together to get out of the cul-de-sac that we are in as well? Really getting stuck somehow. I don't see the way out. Maybe something like that would be a way out. What is your opinion?
Well, I guess my response would be, was 2019 normal, or what is normal? Now, of course, we've had this pandemic and this major war taking place in Europe, which have been huge events with a massive global impact for global geopolitics, for the economy, and so on. But in many ways, they have not changed anything fundamentally. What they have actually done is amplified many of the underlying kind of structural problems and trends in geopolitics that were there in 2019 and have been there in the years before that. And what I'm talking about in particular is the kind particularly growing great power competition and rivalry, which the pandemic and the war seem to have certainly worsened and accelerated. But that problem has been there for some time, and that's the increasing competition, great power competition between the US and China. And we've been living in no longer a bipolar world as we were during the Cold War, but increasingly in a multipolar world where we have probably two major power centers in the US and China. We also have Europe somewhere there in the mix as well. But then we have many other what we could call third powers, which are, have changed the equation as well. So we have Russia coming back onto the international scene in the especially in the 2010s. We have Turkey, we have other big powers in the Middle East, in important powers in Asia and Latin America. We have India and Pakistan and so on. So the world in which we're living, has changed very much from the Cold War years, and that's world has been taking shape over the past decade and driving increasingly not just economic competition, but political and geopolitical and military rivalry as well. So what I would say has actually happened in the last few years during the pandemic and the war in Ukraine is a sharpening of all those tensions. So the idea that we can go back to some kind of normality or what existed before is a kind of fallacy. I think this is the world now in which we're living, and the question is, how what should the world's institutions and major powers be doing to try and avert more crises, more wars, and do something to make sure that we can have a more peaceful outcome in future. Now, I'm not sure about a Congress of Berlin. Probably, I hope not. Probably, I mean, that was a Congress that where great powers set out to reorganize the Balkans, in particular, the wider Balkan region, according to their kind of great power predilections, and it was hardly a great success or something to emulate. This great power reorganization and meddling ended up fomenting lots of tensions. We ended up with the Balkan Wars and then the First World War. But I do think that what is required is much more long-term strategic thinking about the international order and the international security order. So when I say we live in a multipolar world, we have many powers which are incredibly resentful of the way in which the kind of top powers that created the post-Second World War international order are still calling the shots on everything and dominating the institutions, the post-1945 institutions. As I say, we have now many more third powers whose economic and political weight in the world is much greater than it was during the Cold War, yet they don't really have the representation that they aspire to in the international institutions. That's a recipe for conflict and disaster. And it's one reason why the US and the Western powers have found it so difficult to bring the developing world on side in taking sides against Russia and its war in Ukraine, because of this underlying resentment that is there.
Thank you. Now a little bit about Bosnia and Herzegovina and in the EU. The new candidates for the EU membership are Ukraine, Bosnia and Herzegovina, even Georgia. Is this going to be a real deal, or it's just a move to drag these countries out of the Russian sphere?
Well, I wouldn't see it as something that. Sorry, did I interrupt you?
No. Okay. Please do continue. Do go on.
Well, I certainly think that enlargement is back on the agenda, on the EU agenda, in a big way, and I wouldn't interpret this as a cynical move at all. I think there is a genuine concern in Brussels, in the EU, in the US as well, about the capacity of this war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to destabilize Europe's periphery further, and in particular the Western Balkans, but we're also talking about other places as well, such as Moldova and Georgia and so on. So these countries, these left outs on the periphery of Europe. And looking back, surveying these past 30 years or so, I think you would have to say that this was the sin of omission of the enlargement agenda, that it didn't really set out a clear path to membership or to some kind of political and economic association with the Balkans, and also more particularly with the countries of the former Soviet Union. So that was an omission, and we've seen some of the consequences of that in terms of instability on Europe's periphery in recent decades. So I think there is a genuine concern. I think it is serious. There is a recognition that more needs to be done to integrate those countries. Hopefully, they will come up with some new offers and new solutions that are actually of practical benefit for countries in the region. But ultimately, we're still coming up against the political problem that's been there for a very long time now, which is the enlargement fatigue within the EU member states, particularly some of the very big ones, and particularly, I would say, within France and the Netherlands are probably the ones that I would highlight. Germany, has probably been more favourably disposed towards enlargement, and the UK obviously always was and continues to be, even though it's no longer a member of the EU itself, which is maybe ironic, but nevertheless there's still strong support for enlargement to the Western Balkans in the UK, in recognition of the fact that these are much smaller countries which would benefit substantially perhaps from further integration into the EU. So I think it's genuine, but we're going to rub up against this problem of enlargement fatigue. So it's a political problem. And then what we see is President Macron putting forward his idea of a European political community, which was greeted with suspicion by many, I think, in the region, seeing that as some kind of sop or alternative to EU enlargement itself. So my expectation would be that there would be, and we can see it already, renewed diplomatic focus on the region, more effort being put into finding some practical solutions to the problems confronting the region, such as the support for the energy in the context of the energy crisis, so support for the green transition, support for budget support, essentially, for countries to subsidize households and businesses facing problems as a result of the energy crisis. So all that is to the good, but ultimately this is a political question. And it's up to the EU and the member states to decide whether they genuinely want these countries to be part of the Union or not. And if not, then they need to set out some alternative to EU membership and be honest about that, and spell out what they have to offer to the region. I mean, the corollary of this, of course, is that there will be a lot of focus on trying to find a solution to the Kosovo issue and this continued substantive dispute between Serbia and the government in Pristina.
Thank you. I think I would add that we here are a little bit in waiting fatigue in a way. So the question number 4 is about Bosnia and Herzegovina. The UK is a complicated country, and Bosnia and Herzegovina is also a complicated country. How the UK experiences with economy and democracy can be a landmark for Bosnia and Herzegovina to succeed better in its transition from the post-war country 28 years ago. I mean, it's time to move on to functional form. You have very complicated, union. This is Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland. You have all these territories like Jersey and Guernsey and Isle of Man, and I don't know what. All of them have different parliaments, different governments, different relations with London, different relations with Crown. Everything is really, really complicated in terms of language and religion and everything. So you have plenty in dealing with complicated issues on the ground. And Bosnia also has some difficulties, should I say. But somehow, but Bosnia is in the last 30 years from independence on is stuck somehow in a gutter in a way. It's not something that we like here. Can you give us some solutions, some suggestions, whatever you can do from your London perspective?
Well, I'm sorry to say, I don't think there are many lessons here for Bosnia and Herzegovina from the UK. I mean, maybe that's too negative. I mean, I think there are some. At the moment, I guess for any outsider looking in, you could say that both countries, UK and Bosnia, seem to be pretty dysfunctional. We've talked earlier about what's been going on in the UK for the past few years. And if we are to believe commentators both abroad and at home, that Britain is becoming a bit of a basket case. I actually don't subscribe to that view at all. We've had a period of quite unusual political turbulence. Whether the UK can emerge from that in the next few years remains to be seen. Having said that, what is the difference between the UK and Bosnia, and indeed UK and many other countries in Europe? The difference is that UK is not going to turn into a basket case. It has a long period of independent statehood. It has a long tradition of democracy, which gives a certain solidity to its institutions and democratic processes. It's still relatively coherent and strong country in terms of its collective national identity, and that's despite the campaign by the Scottish National Party in recent years for independence for Scotland. That was rejected by Scottish voters back in 2014 when there was a referendum by a quite decisive majority, actually, of 55% to 45%, actually more decisive than the outcome of the Brexit referendum, where the vote to leave was still a majority, but by a slimmer margin than the result of the Scottish referendum. So it was 52% to 48%. So I think it's possible to exaggerate the problems confronting the UK. The UK economy, despite all the challenges of recent years, grew by about 4.5% year on year in 2022, which was outperformed Germany and France and others in the Eurozone and Europe. That's partly because the UK is still lagging behind, and its rebound from the pandemic has not been as strong. But nevertheless, this is not a country that is in some kind of complete meltdown. Looking ahead, the UK is heading for a recession, full-year recession in 2023, but so too are Germany and France and Italy and the Netherlands, and many others, which are all confronting the same problems. Perhaps the UK's might be slightly more severe than elsewhere. That remains to be seen. So I think it's possible to exaggerate the problems afflicting the UK. I don't want to minimize them or say they're not important, because they are important. And I think we need to be clear about what the source of those problems are, which I think particularly is a party political problem for the Conservative Party. Now, looking at Bosnia and Herzegovina, by contrast, to a large degree, this is much more of a kind of artificial state, an artificially created state constructed by foreign powers, outside powers, to their own design. Now, the Dayton Agreement that ended the war in Bosnia at least brought an end to this terrible war in 1995. But it was always something that was likely to be contested by people living in the country, because it was something that was really imposed by outside and imposed on people who did not choose it. This was always the problem, that the constituent parts, the Bosnian Serbs or Bosnian Croats and the Bosniaks, the Bosnian Muslims, all had different conceptions of what sort of country or what sort of state they wanted to live in. So this is the fundamental conflict that has been there from the start. Now, having said that, that was 1995. We're now in 2022, and the Dayton Agreement has prevailed, and we haven't had a return to conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I don't expect that we will either, even though it's a very fragile entity and subject to completing claims and strains and so on. I'm not saying there might not be social unrest or political unrest and dysfunction and everything else which we've seen many times over the years, but I certainly don't think there's an appetite for war or a return to conflict in Bosnia. So it's by no means an ideal arrangement, but somehow amidst the dysfunction, it's actually carried on. We may lament this state of affairs that's prevailed in Bosnia, and the fact that the constituent parts are pulling in different directions. But that's the reality. Now, what could make things better, and what lessons might there be from the experience of the UK? I think one lesson that we should learn from the Brexit vote, and from other things that have happened over the past few years in the US and in Europe too, is that you cannot sustain a democratic political system if you do not pay attention to the concerns and interests of voters. Now, if you have a political system that essentially excludes voters from playing any meaningful role in decision making, if you have a system that fails to consult voters, about their concerns and their interests, then you're heading for trouble. You know, that is unsustainable. This kind of idea that you can have a expert rule, technocratic rule, and really call upon people just to vote every now and again in an election, which is not really going to fundamentally change anything for them and address their concerns. Now, this is the problem, and this is a problem that has afflicted not just the UK, but many countries in Europe, and including in Eastern Europe. So I would say, that one thing that we should take to heart, and one lesson that we can all learn, is that we need to trust people. We need to pay attention to the problems as ordinary people are experiencing them, and try to address those problems. I mean, in the end, that is what politics is meant to be all about. It's meant to be about addressing conflicts, social conflicts, economic conflicts that are thrown up in the normal course of events. And the job of politicians is to try and address those and find solutions to them. So, I think for Bosnia, as for everywhere else, this is something that politicians of all persuasions need to take to heart, particularly in a time of crisis, where ordinary people are really feeling the challenges posed by this cost of living crisis, energy crisis, and so on. So politicians need to get down to work in terms of addressing those problems and coming up with solutions to them, if we want to avoid social unrest in this region in particular, which I think is quite vulnerable to unrest and quite fragile.
Yes, yes, I think that you somehow in the British Isles, had the history of learning to listen better to the voters, but learn that lesson. Yes, thank you, Joan. It was great listening to you. It was great talking to you. Thank you for your participation in the conference. See you next year.
Thank you very much. See you next year.